Hi, I'm Peggy Christie, and I will be reading one of my short stories from my collection, Dark Doorways, available from Dragon's Roost Press. And the name of the story is called Offerings. The scent of crisp apples perfumed the fall wind as it wafted under her nose. The unusual warmth of the air wrapped around her shoulders, but tickled the back of her neck with a cold, sharp undercurrent. A sudden gust took her by surprise, and she heard the faint cry of a car alarm in its wake. Her blonde hair whipped across her cheeks, but the binding ropes kept her arms pinned to her sides, denying her the ability to brush it away. Unable to turn and watch the deepening violet of the night sky behind her, she stared at the sun as it dipped below the horizon. The fading layers of orange, yellow, and pink offered a sense of nostalgia and a reminder of the inevitability that all things must end. As she tried to remember the last time she'd watched a sunset, a single crow flew across her line of sight. Her heart pounded as she observed the lone bird streak through the air, then disappear off to the left. It didn't see me, for now. As the world turned away from the sun, the darkness closed in. She almost missed the three ravens as they flew by. While she tracked them, a fourth bird swooped down, then shot past her face. She could hear its wings flap with furious energy as it settled on top of the post behind her head. Its screech echoed over the empty field. It was calling to its brethren. A warm dribble of fluid tickled the inside of her thighs as her bladder emptied. If the cawing crow hadn't alerted the others to her plight, then the pungent smell of urine would. It was only a matter of time. Within minutes, 3 crows approached. She didn't know if they were the same ones from before, but when a half a dozen more joined them, she realized it didn't matter. The rending would feel the same whether by the first bird or the last. Another gust picked up sweaty locks of her hair and twirled them about. One of the crows darted toward her, but the wind diverted its course. It careened to the right before it could reach her. Its angry cry chilled her blood, raising goosebumps on her skin. The other birds weren't so easily denied. A flurry of ebony feathers surrounded her. She felt the pinch and scrape of claw and beak. One after another, the crows attacked her naked body. They ripped and tore her flesh as they feasted on it. The contradiction between the soft breeze against her skin and the searing pain of the attack almost broke her sanity. As a child, she never could have imagined such a fate. Even the tortures of high school couldn't prepare her for this. As an adult, her mundane routines, predictable chores, and an uninspired imagination molded her into a milquetoast housewife who broke out in hives when the local barista didn't put 2 pumps of vanilla syrup into her latte. When the gods made themselves known, the day they rained fire down from the sky, vaporizing oceans and crumbling mountains, her pathetic life washed away. She witnessed the end of the world as she had come to know it at the hands of an all-powerful, unreachable cabal of supernatural beings. 3 years ago, a growing famine decimated civilization, which devolved into ragged, walled villages filled with the frightened and desperate remnants of humanity. The weekly sacrifices, an attempt to appease the gods' anger, soon devolved into an excuse to destroy rivals, remove obstacles, or simply relieve boredom when an end to the suffering never came. Today she had been judged worthy of such martyrdom. Shackled and stripped naked, she suffered a humiliating march through town where the people pelted her with clumps of mud and feces. She cried and begged for mercy, but they only laughed as they followed the security detail that dragged her forward. When the procession reached the wide expanse near the forest, someone pushed her down. Striking her head on the hard-packed earth, she lost consciousness. She awoke to the setting sun, securely trussed to the 10-foot pole planted in the ground. She twisted her head back and forth to avoid the piercing beaks. She strained until her skin bruised, but the bindings held firm. The crows continued their slow, deliberate feast. Perhaps when the moon rose into the star-filled heavens, death would finally come for her. Her eyes fell on the silhouette of a young man standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was Joshua, her husband, but he wasn't alone. Her best friend Meg stepped up behind him and put her hand on his shoulder. The two shared a smile as they pointed at her, their laughter floating on the wind as it caressed her ravished flesh. Salty tears stung the fresh wounds on her face. She finally realized the truth behind her predicament. Furrowing her brow and squeezing her eyes closed, she screamed. She shrieked and howled until her lungs burned. When she'd finished, the meadow laid quiet. Even her betrayer's amusement had died. Then a soft rustle echoed through the trees as the low brush shook and trembled. In the fading light, she saw something move through the woods. Just before the crows took her eyes, a large, dark blur burst through the trees. The massive bear fell upon the terrified couple with a great roar. When her world went black, she listened to the cries of the beast's victims mingle with the sounds of splintering bones and ripping tissue. As the birds consumed her flesh inch by inch, a chorus of deep, throaty chuckles rumbled across the sky. And she smiled. Hope you enjoyed that. You can get that in this book again or any of my other stuff. You can check out my website at themonkeyisin.com. Thank you very much.
You're tuning in to the 2020 version of the Authors Fair, hosted by Rochester Writers in the Rochester Hills Public Library. My name is Michael Dwyer, and joining us online is Tiffany from the library. Hey, Tiffany, how are you?
Good, thank you.
And our author for this segment is Peggy Christie, who is an author of several different things. As you just heard there with the little darker side, it's dark, but not too dark. Tell us about the piece we just heard.
I can't even remember what inspired that. I think I wanted to try to write something that didn't have any dialogue in it, but I still wanted to try to come up with something that was kind of creepy and sort of dystopian in the sense that it's a different kind of future or a different kind of present than what we have now. But when I started writing it, it was like, this is not going to be long. This is just going to be a nice little short. And that's just kind of what came out.
And this is part of several short stories in your novel?
It's a short story collection called Dark Doorways. So it's just a bunch of different short stories, no particular theme. That was just one of the shorter ones that's in there.
And is there any anything from your life that inspired that story to come about?
That particular story?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. And this was written before the 2020 complete calamity that's been going on. So no, I don't know. It was an idea that just popped in my head. I don't even remember what inspired it. Usually I write everything down where I get ideas from, but that one just popped in one day and I just started writing it. So.
What else can we find or hear in that book? What other kind of stories are there?
It's pretty much all horror fiction. So I know some people don't like to limit to horror, just call it dark speculative, but when it all boils down to it, it's just strictly dark horror fiction. So there's usually a little comedy in a lot of my stories, but mostly it's still horror.
Such as the twist at the end of the...
Yeah.
Would you call that comedy?
No, I don't think that. That's more of like a,
it's,
but not necessarily funny. Did you want to ask something, Tiffany?
Tiffany, you had a question?
Are there writers that enjoy reading or that inspired you to go into horror fiction?
I've actually been watching horror movies since I was a little kid. So I grew up watching Sir Graves Ghastly every Saturday, the Creature Feature. And so growing up on the Hammer films, the Roger Corman films, that's what started me just being in horror in general. But I didn't even start writing until I was older. So, and that just happened to be a really bad day at work. And I wrote a story and it was like, oh, I feel so much better now. So that's kind of how it got started.
Now, writers usually have they all have a different process of how they write their stories. Do you start with the beginning? Like a lot of times when I'm writing, I have an ending already in mind,
Mhm.
and I work towards that ending. What's your process to get to that story?
It usually mixes up. Sometimes I'll be like you. I'll be like, okay, this is how I want something. I want this to happen. It's like, now how do I get there? That doesn't happen as often as either a middle or a beginning, or just like an idea sparks. And it's like, well, let's just start here and just see what happens. And that's usually what I'll do. And then I usually do longhand. I won't sit at my computer and type it out because I'm usually not at a computer when something hits me and or if I want to start writing, I'm usually, even if I'm outside, it's like I always have a little notebook somewhere. So I'll just start writing that way. And then later on, I'll go back and clean it up on a computer. Yeah.
How many books do you have out right now, Peggy?
Right now, I have 2 story collections and a novel. So the one, Dark Doorways, you already saw that one. This is my first story collection, Hell Hath No Fury. And then I have this is my first novel, the only novel I've written so far, called The Vessel. It's a Chinese energy vampire novel that's been out for a couple years. And I just finished this with my buddy Don England, who did the art. It's called Plague of Man. It's a short, like, illustrated novelette. And that link, by the time this interview gets posted, the link will be live for that one. So that's that right now.
Very interesting. Very interesting. You mentioned that after writing, you feel better telling this story. That's kind of hard for me to imagine, since it's a dark story. And how does that work for you internally?
That's kind of funny. I never thought of it that way. No, like for the first few stories I ever wrote, it was a catharsis in the sense that my mother died a long time ago. So it was 9 years after her death, I finally kind of came up with an idea of how to purge all of the things that I dealt with through her illness up to her death. And then I kind of put it into a story. And yeah, the story is really dark and not very nice, but at the same time, it allowed me to kind of get some of the garbage out of my head that had been hanging around for the past 9 years. So in the sense of that, that's what I mean by cathartic, or like exorcising the demons. It's like things that you've dealt with in your life that just sit in your brain or in your heart and you just don't know how to get rid of them. Writing a story with those elements actually helps get it out of your system. And then you can kind of move on, per se, I guess is the way to do it. Mine just happens to be through the vein of horror. So
Some people might do it with love stories.
exactly.
And you're also a member of the Great Lakes Association of Horror Writers.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about them and what your role is with that organization?
Sure. That group started back in 2007. So actually, we're in our 13th year. So we've been kind of having a running joke. It's our fault that this year is a complete disaster because it's our 13th year. But I was actually one of the founding members of that group, and I'm actually one of the officers right now. But we're just a group of people. Most of us are horror writers or dark fiction writers, but we also have members who are photographers, artists, people who just like horror, either reading it or watching it. You don't actually have to be a writer. Most of us are from this area, but we have members across the country. And we put out a few publications every year. Some of them are just for members, some are open to the public. And, when we're allowed to go outside again, we usually go to conventions so that we can talk to people and network and kind of help other foundling writers if they're looking for people who've been in the industry for a while to, I don't know, pick their brain, get some helpful information. We've done some readings, we've done workshops, just kind of just a bunch of mishmash stuff that we just want to get out there to the world.
I was a huge fan of horror and graphic violence when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so much anymore. Am I typical to a readership that it changes as they get older or mature. Tell me more about your fan base and how that may.
Most of the people that we've talked to, or even I've talked to, I'd say 9 out of 10 have been involved in horror in some way since they were little kids, either going to the movies, reading it, watching it on TV, and it has not waned at all. If anything, I think it gets more intense the older they get. I know that's happened with me. I've gotten more brave about trying. I guess, I mean, my perfect example would be Cannibal Holocaust, like watching that film. But I think most people that are our fans or that read our stuff or my stuff have been long time horror readers and writers and fans and watchers. And it just, yeah, it doesn't usually change as they go through life. It's one of the constants that have always been there. So.
And with such a fan base, do you find it's easier to be a successful writer of those genres when that fan base is so popular and they want to hear more from you and they follow you around?
It's inspiring and motivating to have someone come up to you and say, "Oh yeah, I read your last book. I can't wait for the next one." Obviously, yeah, that's very nice to hear and to interact with people like that. I think in general, though, people who want to write or who have any kind of need to write are happy that if they can get that, but at the same time, they're like, "I'm just going to write what I want anyway, and if nobody reads it, well, that's okay because I'm writing it more for me, not for the public." Because once you start going and they're like, okay, well, now people really like that zombie story, so now I got to write zombies because that's what they want. And things change so quickly in the industry. What's popular, they, kind of pendulums back and forth. Zombies are huge now. Vampires used to be huge. Werewolves, everything comes in cycles. So I think it's nice to have a fan base, but at the same time, you really need to just write what stories you have inside your head.
So what can we look forward to you next?
Yeah, I'm going to keep pimping that, to use the word, I hate to use that phrase sometimes, but this Plague of Man, because this was actually maybe a year or two in the making, and we just finished the Kickstarter for it, and everybody, all the backers should have all of their stuff by the end of the week. So this will be live as of Friday the 13th, which is also rather appropriate. Hopefully this will be the first in a series of short novellas. My friend Don and I came up with the idea. We didn't do this year. I know it Plague of Man, it seems like it's appropriate for 2020, but we didn't write it this year. We came up with the idea a couple of years ago. And it's basically creating these plague doctors in this book in particular that are watchers of history. When I was doing research on plague doctors of the 14th century and during the Black Plague and all that, a lot of them weren't even medical doctors. They were just there to kind of witness what was happening, write down numbers, witness wills being written on people's deathbeds. So that's kind of what we created here. And I think we're going to try to make our protagonists like young adult. So in this one, it's Jacob, who's in a concentration camp during World War II. That's why it's SS of the Dead. So it's Plague of Man, SS of the Dead. So it's basically like a crazy doctor's trying to create a perfect soldier, and Jacob somehow gets involved in order to survive. And then the plague doctors kind of come talk to him and witness what the heck is going on. So I'm really super excited about this one.
Well, I think the genre lends itself to so much creativity and so many different avenues that you can take because it is fiction and
Exactly.
it has that same realm of science fiction that allows you to be spontaneous with your thoughts.
Right. And you can take, like in science fiction, you can take something that's real in science and then just kind of extrapolate it to, well, what if it developed this way? And it's the same thing with any kind of fiction. It's like, well, I'm going to take this historical event. And then I'm like, well, what if they went this way? Because what we know about the Nazis now and how they are obsessed with the occult and stuff like that, that kind of lent a little bit to this too. It's just like, well, what if, the whole game of what if is so much fun in fiction. So you can take something based in reality and just kind of twist it a little bit.
Tiffany, what are your thoughts?
I'm just curious to know, like, where does the beginning of a story start with you? Like, what is that inspiration? If it's going to be like you talked about the World War II and the concentration camps, but then also going back to the 14th century and the plague, like, how do you tie all that together?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people would think like, because this is basically a zombie story and they're thinking zombies and Nazis, what? But there are several examples already out there in the movies that it's actually a perfect combination. But my friend Don and I were talking about originally just doing a one-off zombie Nazi story. And he's really good at drawing zombies, first of all. He's good at drawing in general, but he already kind of had this idea for a zombie in a Nazi uniform. And somehow we just started talking, and I don't know how, like, because we were using like a form of the plague to create this story. So I was like, okay, well, let's get into the plague doc. So it's like, the dominoes kind of started to fall, and that's how we ended up here.
That's great.
I find it so interesting that, over and over again, we can take these happenings in life, these historic events, and twist them into tales that not only educate us a little bit on what happened then, but also create a new story, something that, is entertainment.
Right.
So you mentioned the occult. What other truths are woven into your fiction?
Let me think. Probably as of right now, for the Plague of Man series, we started going through historical events where somehow our doctors would either have an influence or watch. And I think the next one I want to work on had something to do with the Kennedy assassination, and how maybe Lee Harvey Oswald was pushed into doing what he did and how he was influenced by these outside forces. It's always fun to be able to look at, I have a notebook full of historical events that you'd think they were fiction, but they're actually true. Truth is stranger than fiction. And then just being able to find those kinds of things, you can just do a simple Google search and put in anything, and something in history has happened in regards to that in some form. So right now, yeah, I'm just trying to think. I don't know if I have too much like historical events in my fiction, more personal stuff so far, until the Plague of Man. And now that's kind of branching me out into looking into more historical happenings. And I could even include like natural disasters like the tsunamis or the earthquakes or the San Francisco fire of the early 1900s, those kinds of things. So those are always fun to look into.
Lots and lots of fun ideas. How would you like to leave it with the viewership today? First of all, remind everybody where to find your books and where to find information on you, and then leave us with a parting thought.
Oh, geez. Everything I have links to everything on my website, which is themonkeyisin.com, which I know seems like an odd name for a horror writer, but there's, I think it's my writerly musings or some tab like that. And there's links to everything there. And, oh, wow, parting thoughts. Now I have to be deep and philosophical. I think for anyone out there who's either who's looking to getting into writing in any form, it doesn't have to be horror or whatever. I think it's just, if you want to do it, just do it. It's like, don't worry about getting an audience. Don't worry about being trendy. Just do what's inside of you to do. And I think the writing comes naturally from that point.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being one of our authors this year. We appreciate it. And we're going to have more with the authors from the 2020 second annual Rochester Hills Public Library Rochester Writers Author Fair coming up.